I remember the first time she spoke like that. Not with the casual politeness of her usual charm, not as the adult friend of my mom I'd been awkwardly polite around for years, but like she was stepping into a space only the two of us could exist in. "Take me somewhere no one knows," she said, her voice low, smooth, almost hesitant, but with a boldness that made my chest tighten. I glanced at her, across the passenger seat, and for a moment the dashboard, the dim afternoon light, even the hum of the tires on the asphalt seemed to shrink, as if the world had folded in around just us. She was impossibly composed, mid-40s and radiating a grace that had nothing to do with vanity. Every line on her face, every subtle curve of her lips, hinted at stories I'd never be allowed to fully hear, but I wanted to. I wanted to hear everything. I cleared my throat and nodded, fumbling slightly with the turn signal. My hands felt heavier, more aware of the steering wheel than usual, as if each grip tethered me to a reality I wasn't ready to confront, that she had just invited me, into a moment that was dangerously ours. She leaned back slightly, letting her hand brush against mine as she shifted. It was fleeting, accidental, maybe, but I could feel it in my bones, like the spark from a dropped match. I didn't pull away. I didn't even breathe differently. I just let the brush linger, that tiny friction humming between us in a way words never could. Her eyes, a muted hazel that caught the light just so, met mine in a silence heavier than any conversation. The car smelled faintly of leather and her perfume, something floral but grounding, like sun-warmed earth after rain. I wanted to memorize it, wanted to hold it in my chest and never let it fade. I found myself noticing every detail, the curve of her neck as she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way her fingers drummed softly against her knee, the subtle rise and fall of her chest with every slow breath. She laughed softly at something I said, but it was quieter, loaded with something unsaid, and I realized I'd been holding my own breath. There was a vulnerability there too, a delicate fracture beneath the smooth veneer of confidence, and it struck me, like a secret being offered, just to me. I wanted to reach across the space between us, to hold it, to make her feel seen in the way I was suddenly seeing her. Every turn in the road felt amplified, every stoplight a chance for her to glance over and smile, and every pause stretched too long. I could almost feel her leaning closer, even though she didn't, and the thought alone made my hands tighten on the wheel. This wasn't reckless, not yet. But it was fragile, charged, like glass ready to crack under our weight. Then, just as I was about to speak, to say something stupid or revealing or entirely too honest, a sudden flash of movement caught my eye. A car door slammed across the lot we were passing, a figure shifting in the shadows, and I realized we weren't alone. Her gaze snapped toward it, sharp, aware, and in that second, everything changed. She looked back at me, just for a heartbeat, her lips parting slightly, eyes glinting with something I couldn't name, anticipation, challenge, warning. I didn't know if I should reach for her hand again or keep driving. The air between us had thickened, and the car felt impossibly small, a private chamber of tension, unspoken longing, and sudden, unclaimed possibility. And then she said it again, softer this time, almost a whisper, "Are you really going to take me?" We didn't speak for a while after that, not really. The car carried us forward, engine humming, tires murmuring against the asphalt, while the quiet settled around us like a fragile truce. I stole glances at her, tried to gauge if the intensity in her eyes was curiosity, challenge, or something else entirely I wasn't ready to name. She fiddled with the edge of her scarf, twisting the fabric between her fingers, and for a moment she looked small, like she'd shrunk into herself, which I realized, almost too late, made her more beautiful, not less. There were stories there, I could see them if I squinted, a past that had demanded poise she sometimes struggled to maintain, the quiet loneliness she'd learned to carry with grace. I didn't ask. I just drove, and watched, and tried not to breathe too loudly. "You drive too carefully," she said finally, voice casual, though I could feel the edge of teasing under it. "I like to be careful," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. She laughed softly, almost a sigh, and leaned slightly closer, as if to press the point, but then pulled back. Her shoulder brushed mine, barely, a whisper of contact, and I felt it travel through me like static electricity. She caught me staring and didn't look away. That was the problem. She never looked away. I thought about why this felt dangerous. Age, first and foremost, the gap was obvious, and I knew it made people raise eyebrows if they noticed. But it wasn't just that. She was untouchable in a way I'd never experienced. My mom's friend, graceful, confident, quietly carrying herself like the world had been measured for her and she'd walked the right path. And yet here she was, leaning slightly into my space, letting moments stretch long enough that the air between us throbbed with unspoken possibilities. I remembered her telling me once, years ago, how hard it had been to trust after her last relationship, how betrayal had left a hollow ache in her chest she pretended wasn't there. And I realized, watching her now, that maybe part of this, her leaning toward me, her daring whisper, her hand that lingered just slightly too long, was her test. Or maybe it was mine. I felt my own hesitation like a weight in my chest. I had never been good at reading women like her, the ones layered with history and unspoken grief. I wanted to ask about her loneliness, wanted to say something honest, but words kept catching in my throat. Instead, I watched. Noticed the way her lips parted when she thought no one was looking, the subtle way she tilted her head when she was curious, the quiet tension that suggested she wanted contact but feared what it might mean. Her hand brushed my arm again, this time intentional, deliberate, and I swallowed hard. It lingered, barely, but enough to make my heart jump and my brain betray me. I wanted to move closer, to let the car shrink around us, to let everything else, the age, the awkwardness, the risk, disappear. But I didn't. Not yet. You ever feel like you're being watched, even when you're alone? She asked suddenly, voice low. I glanced at her, and I think she noticed my hesitation, because she leaned just slightly closer, breath brushing the side of my neck, eyes fixed on the road ahead. There was something intimate in that nearness, a quiet permission that made my pulse skip. Maybe, I said, careful. Her smile was faint, almost imperceptible, but it carried a kind of knowing that made my chest ache. And then, without thinking, she let her hand rest on my knee, just for a second, just enough to spark fire along my nerves, and pulled it back before I could respond. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, weighted, charged. Neither of us spoke, yet something shifted. I realized then that we were both testing limits we hadn't acknowledged before, inching closer while keeping just enough distance to preserve the delicate tension. The car hummed quietly, the air thick with what we couldn't say, and I found myself daring to hope she felt it too, that the pause, the brush of her fingers, the lingering glance, had said more than either of us could voice. And in that shared, suspended moment, I sensed a fragile bond forming, invisible but undeniable, stretching across the small space between us. The diner was almost empty, just the hum of the neon sign outside and the occasional clink of a coffee cup. I pored over the menu, though I hadn't really been looking, my attention kept drifting to her. She leaned across the table slightly, elbows resting on the laminate, and I caught a faint waft of her perfume, the same warm, floral scent that had haunted the car ride earlier. "You're quiet," she said, eyes flicking up at me with that subtle smile that always made me want to speak and freeze at the same time. "I'm thinking," I muttered, keeping my gaze low. Her hand brushed against mine, fingers grazing the back of my hand. It lingered just long enough to make my pulse spike, and then she pulled back like it had been an accident. I caught her glance, half apologetic, half deliberate. I was about to speak when the diner door swung open. A young couple walked in, laughing, and I felt the sudden awareness of being watched, that suffocating, public scrutiny that made every stolen touch seem magnified. She stiffened slightly, subtly retreating behind her coffee cup, and I realized we were both acutely aware of how fragile this closeness was. "I'll be right back," she murmured, standing. I watched her walk toward the counter, hair swaying, every movement casual but charged. My chest tightened with a mix of longing and guilt. What we were doing, even just sitting like this, felt precarious, as if the world might snap its fingers and shatter it. When she returned, she sat down closer than before. So close that the warmth of her thigh brushed mine. I swallowed, heart hammering. She caught my eye and smiled faintly, a silent acknowledgement of the tension between us. Her fingers twitched toward my hand again, paused mid-air, then rested lightly on the table, closer than comfortable, closer than safe. I shouldn't, she started, voice low, trailing off. Shouldn't what? I asked, barely above a whisper, leaning forward even though I tried not to. Her lips parted, and for a heartbeat the words never came. She leaned just a fraction closer, our knees almost touching. I could feel the heat radiating from her, smell the faint sweetness of her perfume mingled with coffee. I wanted to reach for her, to close that minuscule gap, but something anchored me, the fear, the guilt, the impossible nature of what we were doing. We held that suspended moment, the diner fading around us, replaced by the quiet chaos of unspoken desire. Every glance, every hesitation, every brush of her fingers against the table felt amplified, like the world had condensed to just the space between us. Then my phone buzzed, startling me. I glanced down, a message from my mom. My chest sank. The reality outside this bubble was waiting, demanding. I shoved it aside, trying to pretend it didn't exist, but the interruption left a sharp edge of guilt slicing through the warmth. She noticed my flinch, her eyes softening. Without speaking, she let her hand brush against mine again, firmer this time, and I didn't pull away. Our fingers touched lightly, just barely, but the contact sent electricity through me. A long pause stretched between us. I could feel her breath, warm and steady, near my cheek, as though the space separating us was holding its own tension. Neither of us moved, yet somehow, we were closer than ever. Finally, she leaned back slightly, lips curved in a quiet, knowing smile. But her eyes stayed locked on mine, lingering, teasing, almost daring. We weren't supposed to be here, not like this. And yet, somehow, we were, pulled together by something neither words nor reason could fully restrain. The moment broke only because we had to breathe, had to acknowledge the world outside the charged bubble. And even as we tried to resist, even as our fingers slowly parted, the pull lingered. The gravity between us hadn't lessened. It had only grown. The rain started without warning, pattering against the windshield in a steady rhythm that made the interior of the car feel smaller, more intimate. She leaned slightly toward me, her shoulder brushing mine through the thin fabric of her jacket. I could feel the heat radiating off her, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the faint leather of the seats, and it made my pulse hammer in a way I could no longer ignore. "I can't stop thinking about this," she whispered, barely audible over the rain. Her fingers twitched toward my hand, hovering just above mine. I didn't move, afraid that any sudden motion would shatter the fragile tension we'd been holding for weeks. Her eyes were intense, hazel flecks catching the dim light, and I realized she wasn't just speaking casually. She was confessing something dangerous, something real. I swallowed hard, words caught somewhere between my throat and the small space between us. "I shouldn't. I know I shouldn't," she murmured, letting her fingers brush against mine in the slightest contact that felt like fire. "But I can't." I leaned just a fraction closer, careful not to overstep, but desperate to feel her nearer. Her hair brushed my cheek as she moved slightly, and the faint warmth of her breath grazed my ear. I'm here," I said, voice low, almost trembling, though I tried to hide it. "I'm right here with you." She exhaled sharply, the tension in her body palpable. I could feel it pressing against me, in the arch of her back, the tilt of her head, the way her hand lingered just above mine. I wanted to close the gap, to let the distance between us collapse entirely, but the thought of the consequences, the age, the taboo, the risk, clenched my gut with a mix of fear and desire. "Do you want me?" she asked, voice almost breaking, a question that wasn't really a question. I wanted to answer, to reach for her, to claim the moment that had been building between us, but hesitation gripped me. Instead, I let my fingers hover, brushing lightly against hers, savoring the tension without breaking it. The small contact was electric, and I could feel her lean ever so slightly into the brush, as if urging me closer without daring to speak the words aloud. Her eyes dropped for a second, then shot back up at me, glimmering with a mix of challenge and fear. "I shouldn't have said that," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I can't. I can't help it." The car seemed to shrink around us. Every sound, the rain, the engine, the faint creak of the seat, amplified the charged silence. I reached slowly, gently, and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. My thumb grazed her cheek, and she didn't pull back. She leaned closer, almost imperceptibly, the warmth of her body pressing into mine, and I could feel the quickening of her heartbeat under my fingertips. I wanted to close the last inch, to let lips meet, to let everything unsaid finally speak, but before I could, she paused. Her eyes locked on mine, searching, daring me to cross the line. Then, she whispered something that made my chest clench, "If we do this, there's no going back." I hesitated, breath catching, every nerve alive with the weight of her words. And yet, the pull between us was undeniable, a gravity neither of us could resist. Leaning closer, I could feel her warmth, her scent, the soft tremble in her hands, and the world outside the car seemed to vanish. Our lips were inches apart, the final barrier trembling in the storm of everything we'd been holding back. The rain tapped insistently against the glass, matching the rhythm of my heart, and I knew, we were on the edge. And then she spoke again, a single word, husky and urgent, that sent shivers down my spine, "Now." The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the fading light. I thought we had a moment, one unbroken, suspended in our little bubble of the car. But then my phone buzzed again, a name I didn't expect. She saw it before I did. Her eyes narrowed slightly, just for a fraction of a second, and I realized she knew. Knew what, I wasn't sure yet, but her hand, which had been resting lightly near mine, twitched, a subtle pull away that made my chest tighten. "I wasn't expecting that," she murmured, brushing her fingers along the edge of the seat, avoiding mine. Her voice was calm but layered with something that made the air between us shiver. I opened the message, nothing alarming on the surface, just a text from my mom asking if I was running errands with her friend. But the truth was more complicated. Somehow, in her eyes, it wasn't just a message. It was a warning. And I could feel her sensing it, feeling the taboo in the space we were occupying, the risk we'd tried to ignore. I have to tell you something," she said suddenly, voice low. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, fingers interlaced. Her eyes searched mine like she was measuring my soul. "I didn't come here by accident. I've wanted this, wanted you, for longer than I should have." The words hit me like a jolt. Part of me had sensed it, had hoped it, but hearing it was dangerous, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. I felt my hands clench on the wheel, knuckles white, heart hammering. I wanted to reach for her, wanted to close the distance that seemed impossible, yet every rational thought screamed at me to stop. She leaned closer, the subtle warmth of her body grazing mine. My breath caught at the faint scent of her hair, damp from the drizzle, brushing my cheek, almost daring me to lean in. But then, almost immediately, she pulled back, a delicate retreat that made my chest ache. "I can't, we shouldn't," she whispered, yet her eyes betrayed the lie. Desire flickered there, unrestrained, and my own pulse betrayed me, thundering louder than the rain had ever done. Every inch she stepped back, I felt the tension coil tighter, every brush past my arm, every hesitant movement magnified the heat between us. I wanted to speak, to tell her that the risk didn't matter, that nothing else existed except the moment, but my voice failed. Instead, I let my fingers hover near hers, brushing the tips lightly, savoring the electricity of forbidden contact. Her hand twitched toward mine again, paused, then withdrew, and my stomach clenched with longing and frustration. This changes everything," I finally whispered, voice rough. I don't know how to handle it. Her lips parted slightly, a soft inhale that I could feel in my chest. I don't either, she said, voice trembling, though she tried to steady it. And then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned in just enough that the warmth of her shoulder pressed into mine. My hand twitched, itching to rest against her cheek, to close the last inch between us, but she stopped me with her gaze, warning and invitation all at once. For a long moment, we sat like that, suspended between fear and desire, the drizzle outside reflecting the tension in the car. We were closer than ever, yet the truth she'd revealed, the admission of desire, the undeniable taboo, made every second heavier, riskier, more urgent. I could feel the pull, the gravity between us, stronger than anything I'd ever known. My fingers ached to brush hers, to hold her, to finally let go of the restraint that had governed us for weeks. And then she whispered, almost a dare, almost a plea, "Are you going to let me go, or finally see where this ends?" The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside slick and quiet, like the night itself was holding its breath. Inside the car, the space between us was electric, charged with every word unspoken, every glance lingered too long. I could feel her shoulder pressing lightly against mine, her hair brushing against my cheek, each small contact sending shivers I could no longer ignore. I can't. I don't know if I should, I whispered, voice rough, low enough that only she could hear. Her fingers twitched near mine, hovering in that delicious, impossible space. She leaned just a fraction closer, and I could feel the warmth of her body, the faint scent of her perfume, the rapid, uneven rhythm of her pulse against my own. I know, she murmured, voice trembling. But, neither of us has to decide what's right. Just what feels real. Her words hit me like a spark. Real. Everything I'd been feeling, the longing, the tension, the fear, all of it crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. I reached for her hand, fingertips brushing hers lightly at first, then firmer, as if anchoring myself to this moment. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest against mine, just heavy enough to feel, just enough to admit we both wanted it. My heart raced, throat tight, and I could see the same struggle mirrored in her eyes, desire warring with caution, longing warring with reason. I leaned closer, our knees brushing, our breath mingling in a way that made every second unbearably intimate. I could feel her shiver, faint and almost imperceptible, under my touch. I don't want to run away, I whispered, barely moving my lips from her ear. Not from this. Not from you. She tilted her head, letting her forehead rest lightly against mine. Then don't, she said, voice small but steady. Stay here. With me. Right now. Every instinct in me screamed forward, but I didn't rush. I let the moment stretch, savoring the delicate tension as our faces hovered inches apart. Her eyes fluttered closed for a heartbeat, then reopened, glimmering with something raw and unguarded. I saw it, trust, hope, desire, fear, all mingled together, and I realized how completely we had both exposed ourselves in these stolen, fragile moments. I leaned just enough to brush her lips lightly, a tentative, hovering touch that held all the questions and promises in the world. She didn't pull back. She breathed into me, soft and warm, and in that fragile contact, the world outside ceased to exist. Her hand moved to my cheek, and I felt the pressure of her palm, firm and grounding, as if she were tethering me to the here and now. I pressed closer, letting our foreheads rest together, sharing a breath, a heartbeat, a moment that had been years in the making. When I finally closed the last inch, letting our lips meet fully, it was messy, hesitant, perfect in its imperfection. No words were needed. Every glance, every brush of skin, every tremor in our fingers spoke volumes. We had chosen each other, surrendered to the attraction we'd been denying, and in doing so, understood one another completely, all the fear, the longing, the risk, the desire. We pulled back just slightly, foreheads still touching, breaths mingling, smiles breaking quietly across our faces. There was no certainty about tomorrow, no promises beyond this night. But there was clarity, an undeniable truth. We had seen each other fully, and finally, we had chosen to stay. And for the first time, it felt like enough. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving a quiet, almost sacred calm in the night. The car sat under the faint glow of a street lamp, puddles shimmering like scattered stars across the asphalt. We didn't move immediately, neither of us wanted to break the fragile intimacy that had finally been claimed. I reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. Our fingers intertwined naturally, perfectly, as though they had always been meant to fit together. She leaned into me, shoulder against shoulder, and I felt the ease of her weight, warm and grounding. The tension that had clung to us for weeks, the fear, the hesitation, the what-ifs, seemed to exhale in that quiet, shared moment. "You're still nervous," she whispered, resting her forehead lightly against mine. Her breath was soft, close enough that I could hear the subtle catch of it in her chest. "I am," I admitted, a small smile tugging at my lips. "But I don't care anymore." Her laugh was gentle, almost a sigh, vibrating against my cheek as she pressed closer. "Good," she said. "Because neither do I." We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other, letting the silence speak. No words were necessary, the comfort of shared warmth, the steady rhythm of our breaths, the gentle press of lips to forehead, all of it conveyed what had been unspoken for too long. The world outside the car no longer mattered. Age, risk, judgment, all irrelevant. She brushed her thumb along the back of my hand, then traced circles absent-mindedly, as if memorizing the lines of my palm. I held her tighter, careful not to overwhelm, just enough to reassure her, and myself, that we were here, together, fully. "I was so afraid," she murmured, voice quiet, vulnerable. "I didn't know if it was right." "Right?" I asked softly. "Maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe this is just us." Her eyes met mine, hazel flecks catching the streetlight. There was a clarity there now, the kind that comes from having faced desire, fear, and risk, and chosen to step into it anyway. I pressed my lips to her forehead, a gentle kiss that said more than words ever could, and she rested her cheek against me in return. We stayed there a while longer, the world outside forgotten, caught in the simple act of being close, the lingering warmth, the intertwined fingers, the quiet intimacy that had grown from tentative touches and stolen glances. Every doubt had faded into something human, something real. Eventually, she sighed softly, tilting her head so our lips brushed in a gentle, lingering kiss, not rushed, not urgent, just perfect in its completeness. I held her there, memorizing the small movements, the way she fit against me, the softness of her voice murmured into my ear. Finally, we leaned back slightly, hands still entwined, smiles quiet but certain. The night felt calm, complete, as though the tension that had clung to us had transformed into something lasting, trust, desire, and the kind of closeness that doesn't need words to exist. "I think we'll be okay," she whispered, eyes closing briefly, content. "We already are," I said, pressing a final, soft kiss to the top of her hand. And for the first time, it felt like we had arrived, together, messy, human, and entirely ours. 20.